The rain had been falling since Thursday night, and by Friday morning it had turned the red Georgia clay into something closer to quicksand than soil. Earl Buddy Calloway stood on the covered porch of his farmhouse just outside the small town of Harlan Creek, population 4,200, and watched the sky do what Georgia skies did best in late October: pour everything they had onto the land without apology or restraint. He held a ceramic mug of black coffee in both hands, the steam rising in lazy curls before the wind snatched it away. At 74, Earl's hands were a map of everything he'd ever done, thick-knuckled, scarred along the left palm from a cable snap back in 1987. The index finger on his right hand slightly crooked from a break that never healed quite right. Hands that had pulled fence posts from frozen ground, guided steel cables through creek beds, and coaxed rusted machinery back to life more times than he could count. The farm behind him, 12 acres of modest but well-kept land, was quiet except for the drumming of rain on the tin roof of the equipment barn. Inside that barn, under a canvas tarp that Earl re-oiled every spring, sat his most prized possession, a 1952 International Harvester Farmel M tractor. Painted red so deep it looked almost burgundy, its engine rebuilt by Earl's own hands 3 times over the decades. His father, Raymond Calloway, had bought it secondhand in 1961 for $400 and 2 bushels of pecan. Earl had inherited it, and he treated it with the reverence most men reserved for things far more sentimental. His phone buzzed on the wooden side table next to the porch swing. He glanced at it without picking it up. The screen read, "Dylan, mobile." Earl took another slow sip of coffee. He didn't answer. His relationship with his grandson was something he'd long since stopped trying to describe to people. Dylan Calloway was 28 years old, a civil engineering graduate from Georgia Tech, sharp-minded and ambitious, working for a mid-sized infrastructure consulting firm in Atlanta called Meridian Structural Solutions. He drove a new gray Ford F-150 that he kept immaculately clean, wore construction boots that still looked new after 2 years, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who believed that every problem had a solution, provided you had the right software and the right equipment. Dylan visited the farm on Thanksgiving and sometimes Christmas. He called on Earl's birthday, June 14th, usually in the evening when he remembered. He was not a bad person. He was not cruel or deliberately dismissive. He simply had no idea what to do with a man like Earl, a man who had no interest in smartphones, who still kept a paper ledger for his farm accounts, who repaired things instead of replacing them, and who moved through the world at a pace that Dylan found, though he never said it outright, frustrating. Earl was aware of all of this. He had been aware of it for years. It sat somewhere in his chest like a small stone, not sharp enough to cause real pain, but always there, always present, especially in the silence after unanswered calls. He set the mug down and looked out at the field. The lower pasture was already flooded, the brown water pushing up against the fence line. The old county road that ran along the eastern edge of his property, Route 9, a 2-lane stretch of cracked asphalt that wound through the farming communities south of Harlan Creek, was barely visible through the rain. He could see the water sheeting across it in wide, shallow rivers. Route 9 was the main artery connecting the southern farming communities to the Harlan Creek Regional Medical Center. Everyone in town knew that. It was the road the ambulances used. It was the road the supply trucks used. It was the only paved road that didn't require a 20-mile detour through Whitfield County. Earl thought about that for a moment, his weathered eyes studying the road with the instinct of a man who had spent decades reading terrain. Then he went inside and started breakfast. 40 miles north, on the stretch of Route 9 where it dipped through the Calhoun Hollow, a low-lying section of road that locals had always called the Bowl, because it sat below the surrounding fields and collected water like a basin. The accident happened at 6:47 a.m. The Peterbilt 389, a white 18-wheeler operated by Holloway Medical Freight out of Macon, was carrying 3 pallets of intravenous saline solution, 2 pallets of surgical supplies, and 1 refrigerated pallet of temperature-sensitive pharmaceuticals bound for the Harlan Creek Regional Medical Center. The driver, a 51-year-old man named Roger Summerfield, had been making this run every 2 weeks for 3 years. He knew Route 9. He respected it. But he had not anticipated the degree to which the Calhoun Hollow had flooded overnight. The water on the road surface was only 4 inches deep when he entered the bowl, manageable, or so it appeared. What he couldn't see, and what no amount of experience could have prepared him for, was that the shoulder on the right side of the road had been undermined by 2 days of saturating rain. The clay beneath the asphalt had turned to slurry. When the truck's right front tire drifted 2 feet off the pavement, a correction, Roger made instinctively to avoid a deep pothole in the left lane. The shoulder gave way completely. The Peterbilt slid sideways off the road in a slow, grinding, unstoppable motion. All 80,000 pounds of truck and cargo tilted, lurched, and sank into the ditch on the right side of Route 9. Burying the front axle and both right side drive axles deep into the saturated Georgia clay. The trailer jackknifed at a 30-degree angle, completely blocking both lanes of the road. Roger Summerfield was uninjured. He climbed out of the cab into knee-deep water and mud, stood on the roadside in the pouring rain, and stared at his truck for a long moment before reaching for his phone. Route 9 was closed. The first response came within 40 minutes. 2 deputies from the Harlan Creek Sheriff's Department arrived and set up road closure barriers north and south of the scene. The dispatch at the County Emergency Management Office began rerouting ambulance traffic through the Whitfield County detour, adding 23 minutes to the average emergency response time to the medical center. Hospital Administrator Patricia Greer, 55, a trim, decisive woman who had run Harlan Creek Regional for 9 years, arrived at the scene at 8:15 a.m. in her personal car. She stood in the rain in her good coat and looked at the truck, and then she looked at the road, and then she called the county roads superintendent, a man named Bill Hutchins, and told him she needed that road cleared in under 4 hours. Bill Hutchins made the calls. By 9 a.m., a recovery crew from All Pro Heavy Recovery out of Dalton had arrived, 2 operators in a modern wrecker unit, a rotator 1075 Century, the kind of machine that could right overturned 18-wheelers on interstate highways. The lead operator, a broad-shouldered man named Craig Mosley, 36, walked around the truck twice, studied the mud, studied the angle, and then told Patricia Greer with professional calm that they'd have it out within 90 minutes. Craig Mosley had been wrong before, but not often, and not about jobs like this. This time, he was wrong. The problem, as Craig would explain to anyone who asked over the following hours, was not the truck. The truck was fine. The winch was fine. The equipment was extraordinary. The rotator 1075 was a $400,000 machine with computerized load management, real-time tension monitoring, and enough pulling power to move a small building. The problem was the ground. The Calhoun Hollow soil was not ordinary clay. It was a deep, layered deposit of Georgia red clay mixed with underlying alluvial silt from the creek that ran behind the adjoining fields, a combination that, when fully saturated, behaved less like soil and more like a living, resistant substance that gripped anything buried in it with extraordinary force. Every time Craig applied pulling tension, the ground simply absorbed the force and held. Worse, the pulling angle was wrong. The truck had sunk at a compound angle, tilted laterally and nose down simultaneously, meaning any straight-line pull would torque the frame. By 11:30 a.m., Craig had tried 3 different rigging configurations. He had repositioned his truck twice. He had called his supervisor, who drove out from Dalton and stood in the rain studying the situation with the same expression Craig wore, controlled professional frustration. The truck had not moved. At noon, a second recovery unit arrived. Mitchell & Sons Heavy Equipment from Cartersville, a newer company, 2 years old, operating a modern hydraulic slide boom wrecker with remote-operated tensioning. The operator was 29 years old, recently certified, and had handled 24 recovery jobs in the last year. He was competent, eager, and brought with him a small drone equipped with thermal imaging that could map the soil density around the buried axles. The drone data was impressive. The analysis it produced was detailed. The plan the young operator developed based on that analysis was logical. It also failed completely. By 2 p.m., the truck had not moved. Both recovery units were now positioned at the scene. 6 operators, combined equipment worth close to $700,000. State-of-the-art recovery technology, and the Peterbilt sat exactly where it had landed 7 hours earlier, perhaps 2 inches farther from where it needed to be. Patricia Greer stood under an umbrella at the edge of the road closure barrier and watched, and the expression on her face had moved past anxiety into something quieter and more serious. The detour was working, but 2 cardiac patients had experienced extended transport times that morning. The surgical supply shortage was not yet critical, but the pharmaceuticals in the refrigerated unit were temperature sensitive. If the truck's refrigeration unit lost power, which it would, eventually, those medications would be compromised. She called Bill Hutchins again. Bill Hutchins had no more suggestions. That was when Dylan Calloway arrived. Dylan had been on site since 10 a.m., having driven up from Atlanta when his supervisor sent him. Meridian Structural Solutions had a consulting contract with Harlan Creek County for infrastructure assessments, and Bill Hutchins had called the firm looking for any additional expertise. Dylan had grabbed his site kit, his laptop, and his truck, and driven north on I-75 with the windshield wipers working hard against the rain. He was good at his job. That was not in question. He moved around the scene with practiced efficiency, spoke to the recovery operators with the right mix of technical vocabulary and respectful deference, and within 30 minutes had identified the core problem independently. The compound sinkage angle combined with the soil composition was creating a suction effect that conventional straight-line pulling could not overcome without risking frame damage to the truck. What he did not have was a solution. He sat in his truck at 1:45 p.m. with his laptop open running load calculations, reviewing soil mechanics formulas, searching recovery technique databases. He had 3 browser tabs open, a civil engineering forum, a heavy recovery industry database, and a FEMA emergency road clearance manual. He was looking for a rigging geometry that could change the pull angle without requiring anchor points that the saturated soil couldn't support. His phone buzzed. His mother, Sandra Calloway. He answered. "Dylan, honey, I saw it on the local news. Are you out there at the stuck truck?" "I'm here, Mom. Working on it. I heard they can't get it out." "We're working on it," he said again more carefully. There was a pause on the line. Then Sandra said in a tone that Dylan recognized, careful, gentle, slightly hesitant, "You know who might know something about this kind of thing?" Dylan was quiet for a moment. He watched through the rain-blurred windshield as Craig Mosley's crew repositioned their equipment for what would be their 4th attempt. "Mom, I'm just saying." "Mom, we have 2 professional recovery crews and 6 operators with modern equipment. I don't think, Dylan." Her voice was quiet and even. "That man has pulled equipment out of ground just like that for 50 years. Your great-grandfather taught him. I'm not saying he replaces the machines. I'm saying maybe he knows something they don't." Dylan exhaled slowly. He looked at his load calculation spreadsheet. He looked at the truck in the mud. He thought about calling his grandfather, the man he last spoke to 4 months ago on a brief, slightly awkward birthday call, to ask for help with the job that 6 professional operators with nearly $1 million of equipment couldn't solve. He closed the laptop. "I'll think about it," he said. He thought about it for 40 more minutes, until the second recovery unit's newest attempt failed. Until Patricia Greer walked over to his truck and knocked on the window and said, quietly, "Mr. Calloway, I need options." Until he had exhausted every calculation and every database and every forum post, until there was nothing left to think with except the part of him he'd spent years training himself not to need. Then he picked up his phone and called his grandfather. Earl answered on the second ring. "Hey boy," the old man said. Dylan swallowed. "Grandpa, I need your help." The silence on the line lasted perhaps 3 seconds. To Dylan it felt considerably longer. "Where are you?" Earl said. "Calhoun Hollow. Route 9, about 40 miles south of you. There's an 18-wheeler in the ditch, medical freight. Roads blocked. We've had 2 recovery crews out here since 9 this morning, and nobody can move it." "What kind of ground?" Dylan blinked. He'd expected questions about the truck, about the equipment, about what had been tried. Not about the ground. Red clay, saturated, deep silt layer underneath according to the drone soil mapping. Another pause. "Compacted or loose on the surface?" "Loose. It's been raining 2 days. Which way's the truck facing? Downstream or upstream of the hollow?" Dylan stepped out of his truck into the rain, pulling his jacket collar up, and looked at the scene with fresh eyes. He oriented himself mentally. The hollow ran roughly east to west, the creek behind the eastern field draining westward. The cab is pointing southwest. Nose is down, tilted right. Right front and both right drives are buried. He heard Earl make a sound, not a word, just a low, considered note in the back of his throat. The sound of a man running calculations that lived in muscle and memory rather than software. "How long to drive down there?" Earl asked. 40 miles, maybe 50 minutes, in this rain. I'll need an hour to get ready. Don't let those boys try anything else while I'm on the road. Tell them to wait." "Grandpa, I can't just tell 2 professional recovery crews to stop working, then don't tell them." A short pause. "But if they pull that truck wrong in that soil, they'll roll the trailer, and then you'll have a whole different problem. You called me because nothing's working. Let me come look at it before somebody makes it worse." Dylan stood in the rain, water running off the brim of his hard hat. Around him, Craig Mosley's crew was preparing what would be attempt number 5. "Okay," Dylan said. "I'll see what I can do." He hung up and stood there for a moment, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time, the particular discomfort of having handed a problem to someone else. Someone whose authority over it came from somewhere he didn't fully understand. He walked over to Craig Mosley. Craig Mosley was not a man who took suggestions from engineers wearing clean boots, and Dylan knew it. The dynamic between recovery operators and consulting engineers was one Dylan had navigated before. Mutual respect built slowly, eroded quickly. Craig was professional and experienced, and he had been doing this longer than Dylan had been in the workforce. Dylan approached carefully, standing next to the big man while Craig studied his rigging layout, and said, without preamble, "I want to ask you something as a professional courtesy. My grandfather is coming down here. He's an old-timer, retired, been working heavy equipment and recovery in Georgia soil for 50 years. I know that doesn't change your operation, but I'd appreciate it if you let him take a look before the next pull." Craig turned and looked at Dylan with the expression of a man who had been asked many things on job sites and had developed a finely calibrated sense of which requests were reasonable and which were not. "How old is he?" Craig asked. 74. Craig said nothing for a moment. Then, "He coming in with equipment?" "His tractor. A Farm OM." Craig's expression shifted in a way that was not quite disbelief and not quite amusement, something in between. Something that a man with Craig's professionalism kept carefully controlled but could not entirely conceal. "A Farm OM," Craig repeated. "Yes, sir." Craig looked back at the truck. He looked at his own rotator, $400,000 of modern engineering. Currently unable to move an 80,000-pound vehicle from the ground that held it. "Tell him to hurry up," Craig said finally. "I'm not waiting all day." Earl Calloway left his farm at 2:30 p.m. in his 1988 Ford F-250 pickup. Dark blue, rust along the lower door panels, the kind of truck that had been worked hard and maintained carefully for nearly 4 decades. In the bed of the truck he carried 200 feet of 3/4-inch steel cable wound on a hand-cranked reel, a set of heavy-duty snatch blocks, steel pulley assemblies, each one built to handle 12 tons 4-oak anchor stakes, each one 4 inches square and 36 inches long, a 14-pound sledgehammer, a come-along hand winch rated for 4 tons, and a coil of 3/8-inch rigging chain. Most of this equipment was older than some of the recovery operators currently standing in the rain at Calhoun Hollow. The snatch blocks had been his father, Raymond's, rebuilt and regreased by Earl in the 1980s. The steel cable had been purchased in 1979 from a hardware store in Dalton that had since closed. The anchor stakes Earl had milled himself from red oak that came off his own property. Behind the truck, on a single-axle flatbed trailer with wooden decking, rode the Farmel M. Earl had checked the oil, the coolant, and the hydraulics before loading it. The engine, a 4-cylinder gasoline unit rebuilt in 2019, with parts Earl had sourced from 3 different states, turned over on the first crank. He drove south on Route 9 at 40 miles per hour, the windshield wipers beating steadily. An old country station playing low on the AM radio. He didn't think about Dylan's call or about the awkwardness of their relationship, or about the professional recovery crews and their modern equipment. He thought about the hollow. He'd driven through Calhoun Hollow hundreds of times over his life. He knew the grade of the road on the approach, the way the ditch lines ran on either side, the field behind the eastern tree line and its drainage pattern. He knew that the soil in that hollow was different from the surrounding fields, deeper, wetter, more plastic in its behavior when saturated. He knew this not because he had read it in a manual, but because he had worked in it. In 1973, when a Case 1150 crawled off the road edge there, and again in 1989 when a loaded grain truck went into the same ditch in a different spot. And once more in 1994, when a county road grader mired itself during a drainage project. 3 times in that hollow. 3 different problems. 3 solutions that he had worked out on site with what he had, using principles his father had taught him and experience had refined. He thought about those 3 jobs as he drove, running through them the way a musician runs through old songs, not to rehearse them, but to remember the feel of them. By the time he turned onto the final stretch of Route 9 heading into the hollow, he had a clear picture of what he was going to do. Dylan saw the blue F-250 with the flatbed trailer come around the curve from the north at 3:30 p.m. He was standing at the edge of the road closure barrier, and he watched his grandfather park the truck on the gravel shoulder north of the barrier. Climb out slowly. Earl moved carefully these days, his right knee a persistent complaint, and stand for a moment looking at the scene. From where Dylan stood, he watched the old man's eyes move across the scene in a systematic way, not dramatic, not hurried, just thorough. Earl looked at the truck. He looked at the ditch. He looked at the surrounding ground. He looked at the position of the 2 recovery vehicles. He looked at the rigging cable still attached to the Peterbilt from Craig's last attempt. Then he started walking toward the truck, ignoring the rain with the total indifference of a man for whom weather was simply part of the landscape. Dylan walked over to meet him. "Grandpa." "Dylan." Earl glanced at him briefly, a nod that carried warmth but no ceremony. "Show me the rigging they've been using." Dylan walked him through it, the primary pull configuration Craig had used, the modified angle attempt from the second crew, the compound rigging setup that the young operator had built from his drone data analysis. Earl listened without interrupting, occasionally crouching, carefully, with one hand on his knee, to look at specific points where the cables contacted the frame or the ground. Craig Mosley had come over and was standing nearby, watching. The young operator from Mitchell & Son stood a few feet back. Half a dozen people were now clustered at a respectful distance, including Patricia Greer and 2 of the sheriff's deputies. Earl straightened up from his final inspection, put both hands on his lower back for a moment in the unconscious gesture of a man who has been bending over things for 7 decades, and said, "You're pulling against the suction. That's why nothing's working." Craig Mosley crossed his arms. "We know about the suction effect. The soil density map shows. I'm not talking about the weight suction," Earl said without particular emphasis, without defensiveness, in the patient tone of a man who knows the difference between being challenged and being misunderstood. "I'm talking about the lateral suction. The way that silt layer works when it's wet. It doesn't just hold the weight. It creates a vacuum seal along the sidewall of whatever's buried in it. Every time you pull straight or at a shallow angle, you're trying to break the whole seal at once. You can't do it. That seal will hold against more force than you've got." A silence. Craig looked at him. "So what do? You break the seal on one end first. Tip the nose out of the mud before you pull back. Change the angle of burial before you change the angle of pull." Earl looked at the truck, then at the field behind it. "And you anchor back there, not up here on the road. The road shoulder's got nothing left in it. That's why your anchor forces keep translating sideways. You put your anchor stakes in the field behind the fence line, where the soil's still got structure." Craig looked at the fence line. It was 80 feet from the road. "That's a long rigging run," Craig said. "That's why you use snatch blocks to change direction," Earl said simply. "Learned that from my daddy in 1961. Works the same today as it did then." What followed over the next 40 minutes was one of the more unusual negotiations Dylan Calloway had ever witnessed on a job site. Craig Mosley was not a man who surrendered operational control easily. His professional reputation lived in his decisions, and taking direction from a 74-year-old farmer in a wet Carhartt jacket was not something his pride accepted without friction. But Craig was also, above all else, a professional. He had been on scene for 6 hours. He had made 5 attempts. The truck had not moved. And the old man's explanation of the lateral suction seal was something Craig had heard of. In theory, it was documented in advanced recovery literature, but had never encountered described so simply and so directly by someone who had evidently dealt with it before. They negotiated. Craig kept control of his rotator and its rigging. Earl would set the anchor configuration in the field and run his cable system independently, providing the directional force to change the nose angle. The two systems would work in sequence. Earl's set up first to break the forward suction and rotate the nose, then Craig's rotator to pull the truck back onto the road. The young Mitchell & Sons operator, his name was Kevin Pratt, asked if he could watch Earl set the anchors. Earl looked at him, seemed to assess something in the young man's face, and said, "Come on then." Dylan followed without being invited, and Earl did not tell him to stay back. The 4 of them, Earl, Dylan, Kevin Pratt, and one of Craig's assistants, a quiet man named Marcus Webb, crossed the fence line into the eastern field carrying Earl's stakes, the sledgehammer, and the snatch blocks. The field was wet, but its soil had structure. As Earl had said, the root network from the harvested corn crop holding the earth together beneath the surface water. Earl walked the field for 4 minutes studying the ground before he stopped and said, "Here." The spot he had chosen was 67 feet behind the fence line, at an angle of roughly 22 degrees offset from the direct line between the anchor and the truck's nose, a geometry that, Earl explained as he worked, would redirect the pull force across the silt layer rather than perpendicular to it, peeling the seal rather than trying to rip it open. He drove the first stake himself despite his age and his knee, Lanched taking the sledgehammer with both hands and driving the oak stake into the wet earth with the measured, economical swings of a man who had done this thousands of times and had learned to work with gravity rather than against it. 4 strikes. The stake was seated 18 inches deep. Kevin Pratt watched the angle of the swings, the grip, the way Earl shifted his weight. He watched the way Earl tested the stake, not by pulling on it but by pressing against it laterally, reading its resistance with his hands. "You feel for the give," Earl said without looking up, as if he knew what Kevin was watching. If it gives sideways, it'll fail under load. You want it firm in every direction before you trust it. He drove 3 more stakes in a triangle formation, connected them with the rigging chain in a configuration that distributed load across all 4 anchor points simultaneously. Then he threaded the cable through the first snatch block, attached to the lead stake, and walked it toward the fence line, where the second snatch block redirected it through the fence gap and out toward the truck. The physics of it were elegant in the way that simple, effective things are elegant. The snatch blocks didn't add power, they redirected it, changing the angle of force application without requiring any mechanical advantage beyond what Earl's small tractor could produce. The geometry Earl had selected meant that his cable, when tensioned, would apply force to the truck's buried front axle from below and to the side simultaneously, precisely the motion needed to break the lateral suction seal. Dylan stood in the rain watching his grandfather work and felt something shift in his chest that he didn't have an immediate name for. He would think about it later, at length. At 4:15 p.m., Earl Calloway backed his Farmel M through the field gate and positioned it behind the anchor array. He connected the cable to the tractor's drawbar, checked each connection point on the snatch block system with his hands, walked the full cable run once more from anchor to truck, and then climbed back onto the tractor's steel seat. Patricia Greer was standing on the road shoulder, watching with her arms crossed, her expression composed but her eyes intent. The 2 sheriff's deputies had moved the road closure barriers back to give the equipment more working room. A small group of locals had gathered on the north side of the barrier. Word had spread through Harlan Creek the way it always did in small towns, and a dozen people now stood in the rain watching, some with their phones out. Craig Mosley had repositioned his rotator into its secondary phase configuration, ready to pull the truck backward onto the road once. Earl's setup had changed the angle of burial. He was standing beside his truck with his radio in hand. Dylan stood at the fence line at the midpoint of Earl's cable run, watching both his grandfather and the buried truck simultaneously. His role was simple. If any part of the rigging system showed signs of failure, he would call out. It was a basic safety observer position, the kind of thing a junior hand would do on a recovery job. He had accepted it without comment. Earl settled onto the tractor seat, adjusted his weight, and looked down the cable run toward the truck. He checked the engine temperature, running well, had been idling for 20 minutes in the rain, warm and ready. He put the transmission into first gear, the lowest ratio, and checked the hand throttle position. Then he looked up at Dylan. Dylan gave him a single nod. Earl opened the throttle slightly and engaged the clutch. The Farmel M was not a powerful machine by modern standards. Its 4-cylinder engine produced 44 horsepower at the drawbar, under optimal conditions, a fraction of what Craig's rotator could deliver. What it had, which modern machines had been designed to minimize in the name of comfort and control, was raw, direct mechanical connection. There were no hydraulic buffers in the powertrain, no electronic load management systems, no torque-limiting software. When the engine worked, the drawbar pulled. The relationship between engine effort and cable tension was immediate, honest, and unmediated. The cable tightened. Earl could feel it through the seat, through the drawbar, through the frame of the tractor, the resistance building as the cable went taut, the snatch blocks taking load, the anchor array absorbing the reactive force and distributing it across its 4 points in the saturated field soil. He did not rush. He increased the throttle by small increments, watching the cable, watching the tractor's front wheels, monitoring for lift, which would indicate he was overloading the geometry. The engine note deepened steadily as the load increased. For 30 seconds, nothing visible happened. Earl held the throttle steady and waited. This was the part that young operators always struggled with, his father had told him once. The part where the ground hasn't given yet and you don't know if it's going to. The part where the instinct is to either add more power or back off, and the right answer is almost always neither. The right answer is to hold what you have and let the physics work. Raymond Calloway had told him that in 1963, on a job pulling a D6 Caterpillar out of a pond bank outside of Calhoun. Earl had been 16 years old, standing exactly where Dylan stood now, and his father had sat on their old Farmel H and held the throttle steady while the ground thought about it. "The ground always decides," Raymond had said afterward. "You just have to give it time to make up its mind." At the 40-second mark, the ground made up its mind. It was not a dramatic event, not at first. There was a sound, a deep, wet, tearing sound, like a seal being broken on something that had been closed for a long time, and then the front of the Peterbilt moved. Not backward, not the direction Craig's equipment had been trying to pull it. Sideways and up, the nose rotating perhaps 8 degrees in a single slow lurch. The right front axle lifting 2 inches from the bottom of the ditch as the lateral suction seal ruptured along its length. The crowd at the road barrier went quiet. Earl held the throttle steady. The truck moved again, another 4 degrees of rotation, the nose coming up another 3 inches. The buried axle beginning to find a new angle of rest in the disrupted soil. Dylan was gripping the fence post next to him without realizing it. Craig Mosley had his radio to his mouth. "Steady, steady, let it find the angle." The Farmel M's engine was working hard now. The exhaust note ragged with effort, the tractor's rear wheels pressing down into the field soil. The anchor array held. Earl could feel each snatch block through the cable tension. Could tell, from 60 years of this, that the forces were distributed correctly, that nothing was about to fail. He held it. The truck's nose came up 5 more degrees, and then, with a sound that everyone at the scene would describe differently afterward, a groan, a crack, a deep sucking pop, the lateral seal broke completely, and the front of the Peterbilt lifted cleanly from the ditch, 4 inches of clearance between the axle and the clay. The truck's weight redistributed onto the road surface, and the rear drives in an entirely new geometry. Craig Mosley was already moving. "Now," he said into the radio, and his crew engaged the rotator. With the burial angle changed, with the suction seal broken, with the truck's nose lifted and rotated, Craig's pole worked on the second attempt. The rotator's cable went taut, the truck shuddered, and then, in the straightforward, almost anticlimactic way that problems resolve once the real obstacle is removed, the Peterbilt backed out of the ditch and onto the road surface with a grinding, muddy crunch of tires finding asphalt. The rear drive spun briefly in the wet clay at the ditch edge, caught the asphalt, and held. Roger Summerfield, who had been standing to the side for 7 hours, walked to his truck and began checking the frame and cargo. The crowd behind the barrier erupted, not loudly, but with the genuine, relieved sound of people who had been watching something difficult resolve itself. A few people clapped. One of the deputies said something into his radio that ended with, "Road's gonna be clear in 30. Patricia Greer closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds, the only expression of relief she allowed herself, and then opened them and began making calls. Craig Mosley walked across the field to where Earl was disconnecting his cable from the drawbar, moving with the unhurried efficiency of a man who has finished a job and is now thinking about what comes next. "That lateral seal technique," Craig said. "The way you broke the angle before the pull. I've read about it, but I've never actually seen it done." Earl looked up at him. "Your equipment could do it if you rigged the snatch blocks right, but you'd need to know where to anchor, and reading that field soil while it's saturated takes." He paused, seeming to search for the right word. "Takes time. Takes doing it wrong a few times first." Craig nodded slowly. He looked at the anchor array Earl was dismantling. "Would you be willing to walk me through the stake placement? The geometry you chose?" Earl looked at him for a moment, assessing, not the question, but the spirit in which it was asked. "Give me a hand pulling these stakes," Earl said, "and I'll walk you through all of it." Craig Mosley, who had 36 years of professional experience and had never, in his working life, taken direction from a farmer in a wet Carhartt jacket, bent down and grabbed the first stake. Dylan had retrieved Earl's sledgehammer from the field and was carrying it back toward the truck when he saw this exchange. He stopped, holding the heavy hammer in both hands, and watched his grandfather and Craig Mosley work side by side in the rain. The old man explaining the stake geometry with his hands while the professional operator listened with focused attention. Something moved in Dylan's chest again. The same thing he'd felt watching Earl drive the stakes, watching him read the field, watching him hold the throttle with that absolute, unhurried patience. He recognized it now. It was grief. Not acute grief, not loss or death, but the quieter, more complicated grief of understanding too late the value of something you had been present for all along without paying attention. The grief of seeing clearly, finally, what you had been looking at for years without seeing. He stood in the rain with the sledgehammer in his hands and let himself feel it. By 5 p.m., Route 9 had been cleared and reopened. The Peterbilt. Its cargo intact, Roger Summerfield had confirmed the refrigeration unit had held temperature throughout, was being escorted by a county deputy to the Harlan Creek Regional Medical Center. The recovery equipment was being loaded for transport. The small crowd had dispersed. Earl Calloway was sitting in the cab of his blue F250 with the heater running, drinking coffee from a stainless steel thermos his daughter Sandra had packed for him that morning. She had known, before he'd even left, that he'd be out in the rain for hours. He was not thinking about the recovery job. He was thinking about Raymond, his father, the way the old man had looked sitting on the Farmel H on that pond bank in 1963, patient and certain, and entirely himself. There was a knock on the passenger window. Dylan. Earl leaned over and unlocked the door. Dylan climbed in, bringing cold air and wet with him, and sat in the passenger seat with his hard hat on his lap. They sat in silence for a moment. The rain had eased to a steady drizzle. Through the windshield, they could see the last of Craig's crew loading equipment onto a transport trailer. "You could have told me to go home," Dylan said finally. "Could have," Earl agreed. "Why didn't you?" Earl turned the thermos cap, tightened it, set it on the bench seat between them. "Because you called. You could have not called. You called." Dylan looked at the windshield. "I should have called a long time before today." "Probably," Earl said. There was no accusation in it, just the flat truth of an old man who had no interest in performing feelings he wasn't having. Dylan turned to look at his grandfather. Earl's profile, the deep-set eyes, the jaw that had sharpened with age, the lines around the mouth that Dylan had watched deepen since he was a child, was something Dylan realized. He had stopped looking at directly sometime in the last several years. Had stopped looking at because looking directly at Earl required acknowledging something about the distance between them that Dylan had preferred to manage from the periphery of his attention. "The lateral suction seal," Dylan said. "I've read about it. It's in the FEMA clearance manual, page 47, Earl said. Dylan blinked. "You've read the FEMA manual?" "Read it in 1998 when they published it. Thought it was a pretty good description of something I'd been doing since 1965. A brief pause. "They didn't mention the stake geometry, though. That part they got wrong." Dylan almost smiled, despite himself. "Where did you learn the stake geometry?" "My daddy." "Who learned it from his daddy? Who learned it from pulling mule-drawn equipment out of Carolina clay before there were tractors to do the job?" Earl looked at him. "Knowledge doesn't always come in manuals, boy. Sometimes it comes in hands." Dylan was quiet for a moment, then, "I know that. I think I've always known that. He stopped. Restarted. "I got very good at the manuals. At the formulas. And I think somewhere along the way I started. Another stop. I started treating everything that wasn't in a manual like it was less reliable." Earl said nothing. He was listening. "Including you," Dylan said. The rain on the roof of the cab was a steady, patient sound. "I've been building a consulting career on being the person who knows things," Dylan continued, more slowly now, feeling his way through the words. "And I think that made it hard to be around someone who knows things in a way I can't quantify." He looked at his grandfather. "That's not an excuse, it's just what I think happened." Earl turned and looked at his grandson. Directly, the way he looked at ground he was trying to read. With attention, without judgment, trying to understand what was actually there. "You're your father's son," Earl said finally. Ray was the same way. Smart man, engineer too, in his own way. Took him till he was 35 to figure out there were things I could teach him. Then he couldn't get enough. He paused. "You're 28, so you're ahead." It was the closest Earl Calloway came to sentimentality, and Dylan understood it precisely. "I'd like to learn," Dylan said. "The stake geometry, the rigging, the soil reading, all of it. That'll take more than one afternoon, I know." Earl picked up the thermos again. "Thanksgiving's 6 weeks out. You could come earlier." A pause. "Stay a few days." Dylan looked at him. "Yeah? Farmo needs a hydraulic line replaced. You can help." Dylan nodded. "Okay. And I'll cook," Earl said, in a tone that made it clear this was not a concession, but a fact. "Your cooking is terrible." Dylan laughed, a genuine laugh, the first he'd had all day. "It's really not that bad. Boy, last Thanksgiving you put garlic in the cornbread. That's a legitimate variation, it is not." They sat in the warmth of the truck cab while the rain drizzled down outside. And, for the first time in a long time, longer than Dylan could precisely measure, the silence between them was not uncomfortable. Patricia Greer found Earl before he left the site. She walked up to the driver's side of the F250, and Earl rolled down his window, and she stood in the fine rain and looked at him with the direct, composed expression of a woman who dealt in serious things and respected other people who did the same. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "I want to thank you personally. Those pharmaceuticals were time-sensitive. Another 2 hours and we'd have lost the entire pallet." "Glad it worked out," Earl said. "I'd like to compensate you for your time and equipment, whatever your standard rate is." Earl shook his head. "I'm not a recovery company, ma'am. I'm just a neighbor." Patricia studied him for a moment. "Then, at least let me say this. What you did out there today isn't something that gets taught in any certification program I know of. What you have is rare." Earl held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, with the simplicity of a man who has had a long time to make peace with what he is and isn't, "It's not rare. It's just old." He rolled up his window and pulled out of the gravel shoulder onto Route 9, the flatbed trailer with the Farmel M swaying gently behind him, and drove north toward Harlan Creek. That evening, the local news segment on WTLK Dalton ran a 90-second piece under the headline, "Vintage Tractor Does What Modern Equipment Couldn't." The clip showed Earl's Farmel M in the field, the cable running through the snatch blocks the moment the truck nose lifted. It showed Earl, briefly, climbing down from the tractor with his hand on his knee. The segment went online that night. By morning, it had been shared 40,000 times. Kevin Pratt, the young operator from Mitchell & Sons, drove home to Cartersville that evening and sat at his kitchen table with his laptop and searched for information on lateral suction seals in saturated clay recovery operations. He found the FEMA manual reference. He found 2 engineering papers. He found a single forum post from 2009 on a heavy recovery operator's message board, in which a user named Red Clay Buddy had described the exact anchor geometry Earl had used that afternoon, in response to someone asking about a similar stuck vehicle problem. The post was detailed, specific, and correct in every particular. Kevin looked at the username for a long time. Then he saved the post to his reference folder and went to bed. Craig Mosley, on the drive back to Dalton, called his operations manager and told him he wanted to add a module to their training program. The manager asked what kind of module. Craig said it was about soil behavior in saturated recovery conditions, an anchor geometry, and something called the lateral suction seal. The manager asked where the material was coming from. Craig thought about Earl Calloway standing in the rain with a 14-pound sledgehammer, driving oak stakes into a Georgia field, explaining the distribution of load across 4 anchor points in terms so direct that a 16-year-old could have understood them. "I know a guy," Craig said. 6 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in mid-November, with the sky clear and cold, and the fields around Harlan Creek stripped bare after harvest, Dylan Calloway drove north on I-75 in his gray F-150 and turned off at the Harlan Creek exit and took the county roads he'd driven many times before, past the water tower and the grain elevator and the Dollar General on the corner of Main and 5th, and pulled into the driveway of his grandfather's farm at 9:15 a.m. He had come 3 days before Thanksgiving. He had packed enough clothes for a week. Earl was in the equipment barn when Dylan arrived, already under the Farmel M with a trouble light hanging from the engine hood and a tray of tools on the barn floor beside him. He came out from under the tractor when he heard the truck door, wiped his hands on a rag, and looked at his grandson standing in the barn doorway. "You're early," Earl said. Traffic wasn't bad. Dylan looked at the tractor. "What does the hydraulic line look like?" "Corroded fitting on the return line. Should be a 2-hour job with 2 people. Earl nodded toward the tool tray. "Get your hands dirty." Dylan took off his jacket, hung it on a nail, and got down on the barn floor next to his grandfather. They worked through the morning on the tractor, and Earl explained things as they worked, not in a formal, instructional way, but in the offhand, continuous way that knowledge passes between people who are doing something together. He talked about hydraulic line routing, about the difference between fixing a fitting and replacing it, about why the 1952 Farmel's hydraulic system was actually more serviceable than most modern designs because of its accessibility. He talked about the specific properties of the clay soil in the hollow and what made it behave the way it did in wet conditions. He talked about snatch blocks and mechanical advantage and the geometry of force redirection. Dylan listened, asked questions, and worked. His hands, unused to this kind of work, were slower than they should have been, and he made 2 mistakes, one minor, one that required Earl to patiently undo and redo 15 minutes of work. Earl did this without comment except to show Dylan clearly and once what the correct approach was. In the afternoon, Earl took him out to the back field and showed him how to read wet soil, how to identify the surface crust that indicated structural integrity below, how to probe for the alluvial silt layers that behaved differently from the clay above them, how to predict drainage patterns from surface topography. They walked the 12 acres of the farm, and Earl talked, and Dylan listened, and the winter light came down thin and pale over the bare Georgia fields. "My father taught me to read land before he taught me to read books," Earl said, as they stood at the back fence line looking out over the field. Not because books weren't valuable, because land was permanent. Land was always going to be there, whether the books were or not. Dylan looked out over the field. "Were you close to him?" "Your father?" "Close enough." Earl paused. "He wasn't an easy man. Hard worker, hard head, not much given to sentiment. But he taught me everything I needed to know to be useful in the world." Another pause. "That's a form of love, even if it doesn't always look like one." Dylan was quiet for a moment. "I think that's true. Your daddy thought so too." Eventually, Earl turned and started walking back toward the farmhouse. "Come on. I'm making chili for dinner and it needs to be on by 4 on Thanksgiving Day." Sandra Calloway arrived at the farm at noon with her husband, Robert, and Dylan's younger sister, Megan, who was 24 and working in marketing in Charlotte, and who immediately took 43 photographs of the Farmel M in the barn for her Instagram account. Earl bore this with resigned patience. The table was full by 1 o'clock. Earl's neighbor, Franklin Duckett, and his wife, Louise, who had been having Thanksgiving at the farm for 20 years, and Craig Mosley, who had called Earl 3 weeks earlier about the training module and had since driven down to the farm twice for what Craig diplomatically described as consultation sessions and what Earl privately thought of as just talking about work. Craig had brought his wife and their 2 kids who were 8 and 11 and found the Farmel M deeply exciting. Dylan had made the cornbread. He had not put garlic in it. Earl had inspected it before it went in the oven and had said, without inflection, "That's correct." Dylan had taken this as the highest possible compliment and felt accordingly. After dinner, when the dishes had been cleared and the children were in the front room watching football and the adults had migrated to the back porch with coffee and the remains of a pecan pie that Sandra had made from Earl's tree, Dylan found himself sitting next to his grandfather on the porch swing, looking out at the dark fields under a clear November sky. The temperature had dropped to 42 degrees, but neither of them had gone inside for a jacket. "I want to ask you something," Dylan said. "Ask that forum post from 2009. Red clay, buddy." Earl said nothing. "Kevin Pratt found it. He sent it to me last week. He said it was exactly what you did at the Hollow." Dylan looked at his grandfather. "Was that you?" A long pause. "Somebody on there was describing a stuck loader," Earl said. "He was going about it wrong. Seemed like he needed to know the right way. You were on a heavy recovery operators forum in 2009. I had a dial-up modem." Another pause. "Megan set it up for me. She was 12. Dylan looked at his grandfather with an expression that he couldn't entirely control, something between amusement and something much larger, something that had been building for 6 weeks and that he didn't have a precise word for yet. "You've been sharing this knowledge online for 20 years, Dylan said. "Somebody should," Earl said simply. "It doesn't do much good sitting in one man's head." The night before, Dylan drove back to Atlanta. He stood in the equipment barn alone for a few minutes, looking at the farm OM. The hydraulic line was fixed. The engine was right. In the trouble light's warm glow, the tractor's dark red paint looked the way it must have looked in 1952 when it was new, deep and rich and purposeful. Dylan put his hand on the engine hood. The metal was cold. He thought about his great-grandfather Raymond, who had bought this machine for $400 and 2 bushels of pecan, and who had stood on pond banks and field edges and roadsides across rural Georgia, teaching a 16-year-old how to read ground and hold a throttle and wait for the earth to make up its mind. He thought about Earl, who had carried that knowledge for 50 years and then driven it 40 miles in the rain to a hollow where everything modern had failed, and resolved the problem with oak stakes and steel cable and patience. He thought about what it meant to carry something forward, not just knowledge, but the practice of knowledge, the daily application of it, the willingness to keep showing up with what you know and offering it to whoever needed it. He had been trained to build things. He had been trained to understand structures, loads, forces, materials, to make things that would hold. He was good at it, but tonight, standing in the cold barn with his hand on the hood of a 73-year-old tractor that still ran because it had been cared for with attention and knowledge and patience, Dylan Calloway understood something about what it meant to hold a structure together over time, not just engineer it. Hold it. Tend it. Pass it on. He turned off the trouble light and walked back to the farmhouse. 2 months later, in January, Meridian Structural Solutions received a contract inquiry from Harlan Creek County for an expanded infrastructure assessment, roads, drainage, soil mapping in the low-lying sections south of town, with particular attention to the sections prone to saturated clay failure. The inquiry specifically requested that Dylan Calloway lead the project. The scope of work included, at Dylan's suggestion, a soil behavior study of the Calhoun Hollow section and 3 similar locations along Route 9. The study methodology Dylan proposed was a combination of standard geotechnical analysis and something he described in the proposal as field-informed qualitative soil assessment, a term his project manager had asked him to explain. Dylan had said, "It means we walk the ground and learn to read it before we run the models." The county approved the methodology without revision. In March, Craig Mosley's training program launched its new module on saturated clay recovery operations. The module was built from a combination of FEMA manual content, Craig's own experience, and a set of illustrated techniques documented during 2 afternoon sessions at a farm outside Harlan Creek. The illustrations hand-drawn diagrams of stake geometry, anchor array configurations, and cable routing through snatch block systems had been made by Earl himself with a mechanical pencil and a metal ruler, on graph paper the way his father had shown him. Earl had not asked for credit, and Craig had included it anyway. Asterisk technique and documentation provided by Earl R. Calloway, Harlan Creek, Georgia, 50 years of field experience. The module was distributed to 42 recovery operators across 3 states in its first month. 6 of them wrote back to Craig with variations of the same message, that the lateral suction seal technique had changed the way they thought about saturated ground recovery, and that they wished they had learned it 10 years earlier. Craig forwarded every one of those messages to Earl. Earl read them at the kitchen table with his coffee, folded them carefully, and put them in the drawer where he kept important papers. He did not say anything about them to anyone, but the drawer, Dylan noticed on his next visit, had been reorganized, the folded messages placed neatly at the top, easy to reach. In April, when the Georgia spring had turned the fields soft and green, and the dogwoods along the fence lines at Earl's farm had come into white bloom, Dylan drove up from Atlanta on a Friday evening with no particular project in mind and no professional reason to be there. He arrived at 6, helped Earl with evening chores, feeding the 2 remaining cattle. Earl kept more out of habit than economy, checking the fence line along the south pasture, refilling the water trough, and then sat on the porch while Earl made dinner. After they ate, they sat on the back porch in the mild spring dark, and Earl talked about the farm in a way he rarely did, not about the work of it, but about its history. About Raymond buying the land in 1947 for almost nothing because nobody else wanted clay-heavy bottom land. About the first years of hard farming before Earl's father figured out what the soil would and wouldn't support. About the slow, patient process of learning a piece of ground over decades until you understood it the way you understood a person, its moods, its limits, its capacity for surprise. Dylan listened without interrupting, without checking his phone, without the low hum of professional preoccupation that usually accompanied him even in quiet moments. When Earl stopped talking, the night was full of the sound of spring peepers in the creek bottom, and the air smelled like wet soil and dogwood. "You're going to inherit this place," Earl said, not as a question. Dylan looked at him. "I know. You ready for that?" Dylan thought about the question seriously, the way it deserved. "Not yet," he said honestly, "but I'm working on it." Earl nodded once, the nod of a man who considers that the correct answer. "Good," Earl said. "That's all anybody can do." They sat in the spring dark for a long time after that, the old man and his grandson, on the porch of a farm that had been worked and known and loved for 3 generations, while the creek ran in the bottom, and the peepers called, and the Georgia night came down soft and full over the red clay fields that had given them, in their different ways, everything they knew. The Farmel M sat in the barn with the trouble light off, and the engine cold, patient as ground, holding everything it had ever been asked to hold, and ready, as it always had been, for whatever came next.